Greetings, I'm Edward Mueller. I'm the president of the University for International Cooperation in Costa Rica. I'm going to take the challenge of explaining something about climate change in a few minutes. Of course, if we want to go more into depth, we need more time. But this is just a short trailer. Climate change is actually the consequence of global change. Global change is the way humans are changing their planet. And if there's one message I want to leave very clear tonight, is that it's not just about polar bears. A lot of people are thinking climate change is up in the poles and affects polar bears. My message for today is climate change is here and it's affecting all of us. Actually, as civilization, we stand in a critical moment in time of Earth history when we have to decide our future. The people who are alive today, the people who are on this planet today, young and old, have to decide if we want to live in a planet like we've known it for thousands of years, or if we want to live in a different planet. Our main challenge is population growth. Population has increased tremendously. Today we have more humans living on the planet than throughout history. And actually, if you try to place yourself, as I did, in that curve, I was born in 1958. We were less than 3 billion people on this planet. Last year, we crossed the 7 billion people on the planet. This is an exponential growth, and we'll probably grow to about 9 billion people if we keep on with the same trend. The problem is not only the number of people, it's as population increases, the red dots, CO2 emissions increase with blue dots. And it's not only about numbers, it's about how we are living. In a country like Costa Rica, which is very environmentally oriented, we have 1 car for every 4 people. Our State of the Nation report in 2010 said that we were requiring by 2030 142% more territory than what we have now to satisfy our demands on consumption. Last year's report said that each of us in Costa Rica consume 13% more of what we actually should be consuming in terms of natural resources to satisfy our current demands. I was lucky enough to be born in a country with 5% of the Earth's biodiversity, and in a region, Latin America, with tremendous wealth in cultural diversity. Cultural diversity is important, and we're losing it almost faster than biodiversity. We're losing it by having everybody want the same things throughout the planet, by having everybody want to dress the same throughout the planet. Homogenizing civilization, homogenizing cultures. And we're losing a tremendous amount of knowledge that's embedded in each of these cultures. This knowledge will be very necessary to help us face the challenges of climate change. This kid on the left is my son, my older son. He looks like this now. And here on the right is my new kid. He's 8 months old. Between the first one and by the time the second one can walk and go with me to protected areas, go with me into nature, he'll only be able to see 60% or maybe 65% of the biodiversity that my first son was able to see. We're losing about 30% of our diversity right now. And it's not only in Costa Rica, it's throughout the planet. When we talk about how much is that nature worth, the natural capital, a friend of mine, Bob Constanza, and a group of scientists back in 1997 estimated that the world produced in services, and we can see this as having capital and having interest on that capital. So we take the interest that the capital is producing and use them, that would be sustainable development. But we've grown into using all the interest and chewing up part of the capital every year. The gross national product at a global level is $18 trillion per year, whereas natural capital is 33. And those 18 trillion are that high because they're chewing up natural capital in terms of minerals, in terms of resources, water, and polluting and destroying this natural capital. When I was born, again in 1958, this planet was still very balanced. We didn't talk about loss of natural capital. And the CO2 levels in the atmosphere were under 320 parts per million. As time went by and I graduated from university, we were already reaching 340 parts per million, and there were already documents saying that we were chewing up part of this natural capital. I was already talking about climate change in 1998 when the first report came out saying that we had chewed up 12% of natural capital and the CO2 emissions had gone above 350 parts per million. In 2009, we had a new report with 32% of our capital gone, and we were getting close to 400 parts per million in CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. I don't think I want to be on this planet when I'm 100 years old, because we have chewed up 70% of the natural capital, and our atmosphere will not make a good living on this planet anymore. This year, on the 22nd of August, we reached the point where we had eaten all the interest and we started chewing capital. Last year, that date was later, in September. Every year, we're getting to a point where we eat up our natural capital, the services that ecosystems provide, and we start living on chewing up the capital that's left. It's called the Earth Overshoot Day. This is our planet at night. Of course, in white we see, especially in the US and Europe, electricity. The planet illuminated artificially by us at night, also in India and in parts of Asia. In red, you see fires. Land use change through fires. In yellow, those are those flares that we have when we dig oil. You can see them from space. Central Russia, Alaska, Ecuador, parts of Africa, Middle East. Interesting here is the light blue. The light blue, I don't know if you can guess what it is. There are fishing fleets at night. You can see in Korea, the ocean is illuminated at night by these tremendous amount of lights that are used to attract fish and squid. And this can be seen from satellites out in space. Our planet is going from a blue planet with a good temperature to live at to a red planet. And it's going pretty quickly. And it's not going uniformly. If we look to the north in the Arctic, it's turning red quicker than the rest of the planet. And we also see spots of dark red in the Antarctic. That means that our planet is not warming up evenly. Our mountains are warming up faster than at sea level, and our poles are warming up faster than the rest of the planet. This is bad news. This is bad news for the ice caps, of course. For the ice caps up in the mountains, and for the ice caps on the poles. If we look back in history, and we have been able to do this thanks to ice, where we melt and take the bubbles that were trapped, and we can determine very much precisely how the atmosphere was 800,000 years ago. And we determined the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere during those 800,000 years. And we see that we never went above the 300 parts per million. The CO2 levels are very much the same as the temperature levels. If you have high CO2, we have high temperatures, low CO2, the lower temperatures. That means that there is a strong relationship between the amount of carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere and the temperature. In the last years, we've been able to make these CO2 levels rise to unprecedented levels, and the temperature is rising after it. If we don't change, by 2050, we will have conditions that will make living on this planet a lot more difficult for a lot more people, rich and poor. We've seen lately that it's not only the poor people in the tropical countries that are being affected, as in the last few decades. New York is being affected. Now, why is it so difficult to change? First, our way of learning in the Western Hemisphere does not give us holistic approaches. We are specialists. We're specialists, and sometimes so specialized that within one university school, the experts don't talk with each other. So we cannot tackle complex problems because we don't have actually the ability to look at complex issues and look at them holistically. The other thing is that in order to get change is an emotional level, an emotional event at a personal level. But in order for change to have impact, it's not the individual that has to change. We have to get to collective change. And that is where it's difficult. People prefer to go to a reassuring lie instead of the inconvenient truth. We don't want to be bothered in our comfort zone. We don't want to hear bad news. This is well studied. The whole process of change is very well studied. There are lots of publications out there. We first go through a process of denial, and today on this planet, there's still too many people in denial. That's where we say this can't be true. Then we get mad. Then we go through bargaining. Oh, I'll change a few things. I'll recycle. I'll buy a Prius. I'm doing good. Then we start getting scared. Uh-oh, this doesn't look good. Then depression. There's nothing to do anyway. So, what the heck? Until we finally get to acceptance. And in acceptance, that's when we start having the peace of mind to be able to think strategically, think clearly, and decide and start with our actions. And we have to get very quickly to that stage of acceptance globally. The International Energy Agency, last year, about this time, brought out news that's saying we had very few years to avoid total destruction of the planet. We were going into irreversible climate change. This was just before the Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting in Durban. If we look at the CO2 levels in the atmosphere, throughout years, throughout many international meetings, we see that none of these meetings have had any effect on the CO2 levels. So these meetings, this United Nations process, is not where the change is going to come from. Last year, we broke records. We broke records in CO2 emissions. We got to 31 gigatons of carbon put out into the atmosphere just last year alone. We had, in 2009, tremendous forest fires, which changed the way you fight forests in Australia. We had them in Russia a year later. And this year, it was US who had to fight fires that were not seen before in history. We've had lots of early warnings. When Katrina hit, we knew about climate change. We still didn't act. Last year, New York got hit by a hurricane. And this news came out 1 year after, and we didn't expect a second hurricane to come a few weeks after that. Superstorm Sandy was an eye-opener for many people. Many of those in denial said, ooh, there's something that could be true about the whole thing. For years, people were being warned. And for years, scientists said, well, this could be happening in New York. Now, we have reaction. And Cuomo says, Whoever doesn't see extreme weather pattern is denying reality. Many, many years of information were not taken into consideration. We could have avoided a lot of what's happening today if we would have taken action when James Hansen brought out the first news about climate change, close to 30 years ago. The Executive Secretary of the Convention on Climate Change, she's Costa Rican. She says that the world must face that inconvenient truth. Emissions are rising. And on top of that, we have denial. We have lots of strong groups, corporate groups, most of them oil-based or related with the oil industry, where they're saying climate change does not exist, in spite of all the evidence. The Koch brothers are famous for funding. They funded over $60 million to scientists to produce information saying that climate change does not exist. The Rio Summit, which just happened this year, over 20,000 people got together to discuss the Earth's future. Nothing more than good intentions came out. And actually, if we were wrong, what would be so wrong in trying to make a better planet? Because the things you have to do to fight climate change, the only result they could have is a better planet. These international meetings, they're looking and they're aiming at 450 parts per million. 450 parts per million is a death penalty for mountains, is a death penalty for many other ecosystems like the oceans. We know that the planet should not have gone above 350 parts per million, and we have to get back to that. But that we crossed in 1987. The International Panel on Scientists in Climate Change, IPCC, they are telling us that if we wanted to get to 450 parts per million, we'd have to reduce emissions, or would have had to reduce emissions, maybe 2002, 2003. If we reduce emissions by 2015, we'll get to 490 parts per million, probably. If we wait, because 215 is too close, and we wait until 2020, we'll be above 500 parts per million. That means 6-7 degrees higher temperature globally on the average, which is a lot more than that up in the Arctic and up in the mountains. These are the scenarios from the IPCC. The worst case scenario, business as usual. Well, let's see what's happening. This is our CO2 emissions. That little nip there, that is the economic meltdown. So the world crisis got CO2 emissions a bit lower. But in the rest, we're actually above the worst case scenarios. And I'll just speak a little bit about the Arctic sea ice. This year, we crossed another record. 400 parts per million of CO2 in the Arctic. If we look at Greenland, the seasonal thawing of the ice cap in Greenland, 1992 was that red part. 10 years later, it increased. 3 years later, it increased even more. 2 years later, even more. This year, NASA says a strange and sudden ice melt in Greenland. 97% of the ice cover, the ice sheet in Greenland started melting this year. This is scary. There's enough ice here to elevate sea level by several meters. What's so important about the ice melt? How does it affect us besides the sea level rise? Well, it's called the albedo effect. Light coming in and hitting the white surface is reflected as light and can go back out into the space. Light coming in and hitting a dark surface like the ocean turns into heat. That heat is trapped and heats even more the Earth and the oceans and melts even more ice, which is a positive feedback for heating. And this year we broke another record. We got to 18% less ice than in 2007, which was our previous record. This is happening in Antarctica too. It's not only in the north. And the consequence of sea level rise are not anymore those 59 centimeters with about 2 feet, as the IPCC was saying. We're looking now at science that is telling us we'll be above 1.50 meters, maybe even more, 5 to 6 feet by the end of the century. The USGS is bringing out news. about accelerating sea level rise in the US Atlantic coast. And in spite of this evidence, what's happening? The Senate in the state of North Carolina passed a bill banning state agencies from reporting that sea level rise is accelerating. You cannot stop the sun with your thumb. We cannot blindfold ourselves by passing a law prohibiting information. Where's the freedom of speech? The population has to know that if they live on the coast, they're going to be facing a lot of problems in the future. Cancun, that's how it's going to look in the future. But we don't have to go to projections, we can go to now. This is a national park, Cahuita, in the Atlantic coast of Costa Rica. I took this photo in 2008. When my older son was still a kid, we used to camp there, and there were 200 meters of sand, of beach. Today that beach is gone, and the forest is starting to disappear. The palm trees are just falling in. These are 4 years ago. This photo I took a week ago. That's the same place. The only thing that's left is rubble, and all the palm trees are gone, and now the forest that's behind is also dying because of the salt that's creeping into the aquifers. And we have more news. Abrupt climate change, where this whole warming process is thawing soil that had been frozen for many thousands of years and is releasing methane. Methane is very strong at capturing heat. The more methane that's released, the more heat that will be trapped, the more methane that will be released in the future. If all this methane gets released, we don't have a viable planet. And just from 2003 to 2007, in 4 years, scientists reported a 31% increase in methane release from these soils. And nowadays, there are over 150,000 of these methane seeps throughout the north, in Russia, in Alaska. In terms of biodiversity, going back to what my son is not going to be able to see. In 2010, the year of biodiversity, this interesting document was produced. Ban Ki-moon says that the consequences of the collective failure of not stopping biodiversity loss, if not quickly corrected, will be severe for all of us. What happens when pollinators are gone? Who's going to go to an orchard grove and with a little brush go from flower to flower to pollinate? How much is a bee worth? The oceans are dying. They're acidifying, they're capturing CO2, but they're turning acid. So all our shellfish will be gone. So change will be permanent. Change is permanent. We have to learn to live with it. And that's our biggest challenge. Do we have the professionals to live with it? Do we have the policies and the actions in place? Will we recognize the urgency and the magnitude on time to be able to react? What to do? There's lots of information. Just Google mitigation. You'll find lots of recipes on how to cut emissions. Smaller cars, no Hummers for sure. Changing light bulbs. But now we have to go a step further. We really have to take action. We can measure our carbon footprint. Personal, our business carbon footprint. If we look at a pizza in Cape Town, 80,000 kilometers is what a pizza generates and a bowl of salad. The products are brought throughout the world. So we have to start thinking of what we're eating, what we're doing, what we're buying. We have to look at product life cycle. From where the minerals are extracted and what the damage has been done, for example, the Andes and the Amazon countries, to the garbage that we produce. It's not only recycling, it's not only driving a Prius. Where does the minerals that are in that Prius battery come from? And where do they go after the battery is dead? We cannot keep on producing garbage the way we produce it. The Pacific garbage patch is killing our oceans too. All that stuff came from the stomach of that bird. That is not fair. And that will slash back at us as a civilization. Apple and other companies are starting to publish their footprint. This is a good step forward. But we need to adapt now. We need to learn how to live with climate change. And this requires a very complex process, which also requires that our universities change, our research centers change, our policy changes. We cannot have any more sectoral decisions. We need to integrate government, science into holistic approaches. And we need to have ethics and transparency. We need information. Politicians cannot block the access to information. Adaptation is local. There are no recipes. Upstream and downstream, there will be two different strategies for adaptation. There are no recipes at all. In my country, adaptation will change in 20 kilometers. We need to empower communities with knowledge, with technology, with guidance. We need to act now to ensure that we have a possible future. Obama's victory gives hope to many people, even to us in countries outside the US, because we need the US to take leadership. The US has to start changing. Why? Not only because its impacts are important for the whole planet, but that model of development is being exported to all of our countries. People here in my country look up to the US and try to imitate. Lots of people love to have Hummers because they saw a governor driving a Hummer and they thought it was important to drive a Hummer. But climate change is not about politics. It's not only about technology. Technology will help. We need a new paradigm for development. We need new leadership. We need new governance systems, but we need to value people for what they are, who they are, not for what they have. So our value system in our society has to change. We need to seek in the beginning, where we have a change in mind and in heart. Especially our heart has to change. This is not a question of wallets. Money won't save anybody. We need to act locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. And our cultural diversity has to be rescued because the knowledge that's in there will allow us to adapt to a changing planet. So we're there. We're at the moment where we have to make up our minds if we want to keep on living on a planet as we know it, or as we knew it. And let's hope we can make a change. All of us, you, me, all of us have to start making a change. Thank you.